My name is Anthony Esselin. I'm a professor of English at Providence College. This is the third in a series in which we're examining the doctors of the church and their relation to the great medieval poet Dante. When we last left our hero Dante, he was in the middle of the Inferno, and we were talking about the punishment that the damned suffer of the loss of the intellect. And I'd like to begin this episode by building upon that. I'd like to talk in this episode about the absurdity or the illogic of sin. Now, we modern folks, I'm afraid, think that faith follows upon knowledge. That is to say, before we give our faith over to somebody or some truth, we ask to have it examined thoroughly and to have it all laid bare before us, all brought to light before we finally consent and say, well, yes, I will deign to believe in that. The reverse, though, seems to be true and seems to be what Jesus in the Scriptures recommends to us. That is not that obedience follows when we are finally enlightened, but enlightenment is what follows obedience. This is Jesus in the Gospel of John. He who keeps my commandments loves me, and he who loves me shall be loved by my Father, and I will love him and will manifest myself to him. Therefore, he who obeys me, he who keeps my commandments, will be given greater light. But sin, especially sins against faith, sin darkens the mind. This is made manifest in all of the sinners below, but today I wish to focus on two classes of sinners, two sinners that show us, in fact, the illogic, the absurdity, the stupidity of sin. So, for our first scene, I'm going to Canto 13 in the Inferno. All at once, Dante and Virgil find themselves in the midst of a dark and gloomy woods. Let me read you the description here. It was a place unmarked by any kind of path. Its leaves not green, but dingy and dull black. No slender limbs, but hunched with knots and gnarls. No hanging fruit, but sticks and poisonous thorns. What kind of odd place this is. All Dante sees are these strange and frankly strangely muscular contorted trees and harpies, these ministers of vengeance in classical mythology, with the faces of women and the bodies of birds of prey that perched on the branches of these trees and would chew the foliage and cause the trees pain. We don't know what's going on here yet. Dante doesn't see any souls, and he's surprised by this. He thinks, in fact, that they might be hiding behind the trees. Virgil, in order to disabuse him of this thought, says, why don't you break one of the branches of the trees and see what happens? At that, I reached my hand out gingerly, and from a thorn tree plucked a little branch, and its trunk cried, why do you hack at me? When it had darkened with its dripping blood, it cried anew, why do you mangle me? Isn't there any pity in your soul? Once we were men, now we are stubs and stakes. Your hand might well have felt more sympathy, even if we'd been the souls of snakes. Here is a human being imprisoned in vegetative form. The human being in question, who he is we will learn soon, has violated reason, which is the very principle of that God-given purpose for which we are made. That is to see God, to look upon him face to face. This is the good of the intellect for which all human beings are made. I'd like to read to you something that I wrote in the notes for this particular canto. It applies to all sin. It applies to the suicide in particular. Somewhere in every sin, no matter how small, the first of sins is repeated. That is, you shall be as gods, the temptation of the serpent in the Garden of Eden. I'm a creature, but I wish to be the creator. Specifically, I wish to be my own creator, creature and creator both, dividing myself from myself and disposing with myself as I see fit. Well, in any case, Dante here now meets this man, and he tells his story, who he is and how he got there. He was a poet in Sicily and a courtier. He was a servant of Frederick II of Sicily. His name is Pier della Vigne. He was a good courtier, as courtiers go. He was devoted to his lord, so devoted, in fact, that it consumed his whole life, and it caused the other people at the Sicilian court to be consumed in envy against him. This is Pierre now speaking. You've got to follow the tangles of his rhetoric, please. I was the guardian of Frederick's heart, the emperor's trusted man who held the keys, locking, unlocking, with so soft an art. I stole most of the other courtiers from his secrets. In that glorious duty I kept faith so well, I lost my sleep and wore my pulse away. Pausing here for a moment. He is a loyal courtier, but there's something rather suspicious in his desire to have Frederick all for himself, and to be, as it were, almost the Pope over Frederick's being. He exercises this generally benevolent control over Frederick, and this is itself somewhat disordered and perhaps prepares him for the suicide to follow, because he says he lost his sleep over it, he wore his pulses away. Do the courtiers in Sicily repay him with gratitude? No, of course not. It was in Sicily then, as it is, I'm sure, in most state capitals and national capitals now, that if you are in favor with the president or the governor, you can be sure that there will be people behind you wanting to claw at you so as to bring you down. That happened to Pier della Vigne. He was accused unjustly of treason against Frederick and thrown in prison. What he did then shows most clearly the illogic of sin. My spirit, he says, relishing the taste of scorn, thinking that I could flee their scorn in death, made me against myself, though just, unjust. That is an almost impossible passage to follow, and Dante has made that, has set it up to be nearly impossible. That's deliberate on his part. They have scorn for him, and that's why they've put him in that prison to begin with. They hate him. And he answers their scorn with scorn, as if to say, well, you think you are going to punish me, you think that you are going to get me down. I won't give you the pleasure of seeing me suffer any longer. I will kill myself. In fact, he dashed his brains out against the wall of his prison cell. He thought to fight scorn with scorn, which is itself somewhat illogical. And then he says, injusto fece me contra me justo. Unjust, I made myself against myself just. I mean, that's literal how it reads in the Italian. It made me against myself, though just, unjust. He was unjustly imprisoned, and now he takes remedy for that unjust imprisonment by committing an unjust act himself, as if he were the creator meting out punishments for injustice. Only he punishes himself for the injustice. I was just, and now my desire to flee their scorn made myself unjust against myself. I mean, there you have it. If you can follow the tangles of that sin, then you might be able to follow the gnarls and knots in the tree in which he is now imprisoned. I mean, it's a horrible fate, and yet it's a fate that we should have been able to predict. Thomas Aquinas says of suicide, life is a gift divinely granted to man, and is subject to the power of him who puts to death, and who makes a man to live. So whoever deprives himself of life sins against God. As a servant who kills a fellow servant sins against the servant's master, or as one sins who usurps a right of judgment that has not been granted to him. I should repeat that, because we tend in our modern age to think of ourselves as co-creators of ourselves. A very strange idea, Thomas would say. Our life is a gift to us. We cannot dispose of it without sinning against God. That life that we possess is not ours so much as our servant and God's servant. To kill it is to kill a servant of God. It's to sin against that master. It is also to usurp the position of God, to usurp a right of judgment that has not been granted to us. So the punishment of the suicides illustrating very clearly, I think, the logic of sin.